Hello Internet, it's AndrewMycol and welcome to this week's episode of the AndrewMycol Podcast, the podcast where we talk about Power Rangers, Super Sentai, and more. This week we are bringing up the topic, should Hasbro or somebody adapt Kamen Rider, and why I think it would be interesting to see Kamen Rider in general being adapted once again, just like we saw back in the day with Kamen Rider Dragon Knight. If this podcast does interest you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss a single episode of this podcast. With that being said, let's get into it. So, it was brought up on my stream by a viewer named Orville. By the way, if you want to check out his channel, that'll be down in the description below. And if you want to help out the channel, you can get this podcast early on patreon.com/AndrewMycol2, where you can get this podcast for a day early. So, why I think Kamen Rider should be adapted again, whether it be by Hasbro or by someone in general. So if you don't remember, I think it was about 5, 10, I don't remember what year it was, but Kamen Rider Dragon Knight was the first Kamen Rider series to be adapted officially and made Americanized, where it was basically, American actors, and they had some footage from Kamen Rider, and they were able to use that and basically make their own version of Kamen Rider, just like you see with Super Sentai and Power Rangers, where Power Rangers uses footage from Super Sentai, and they build their stories around that. Now, the odd thing is, that was the last time we saw Kamen Rider being adapted, and since then it's mainly been in Japanese, with Kamen Rider being prominent with Toei and with Tokusatsu. Now, the question remains, well, should they adapt Kamen Rider? And the answer is, I think they should. And the thing with Kamen Rider, it's like Super Sentai. Of course, a lot of people know about Dino Fury, but even less people know about Super Sentai, and even less people from that know about Kamen Rider. See, back in the day, I think it was only like last year I finally watched Kamen Rider a little bit before, the pandemic hit, and I was watching 01. And I thought 01 was a pretty decent little Sentai, not Sentai. 01 was a pretty okay Kamen Rider. And it was the first Kamen Rider I started watching. Obviously, I watched bits and pieces of other Kamen Riders that went along as well. Gaim obviously being another one. And I thought, man, why haven't they tried adapting Kamen Rider more? Like, you would think, with Dragon Knight, of course, it's different than what you'd see with Power Rangers. But if you think about it like this, in most Marvel movies, you'll see like this focus on one superhero, where it'll be this one superhero and it'll be the cast around it, and they build upon that, right? That's how Kamen Rider is. You have one main hero, you have your villain, you have your side characters, and they all have belts, or in most cases belts and whatnot to henshin with. And with that, it's a very neat thing to do, right? And you would think, well, this should appeal. Why don't they use it more often? But that's the one thing that has confused me, is why don't they do more Kamen Rider? And that is the question that I ask, is why shouldn't they? First off, I do think with Power Rangers being, still popular, I think Hasbro would look at Kamen Rider and say, I wonder if we try adapting Kamen Rider, and turns out they should, because I think, for one, there's a big audience for it. And there's enough people doing Power Rangers, right? And if there's a decent amount of people that are following Super Sentai, they probably know about Kamen Rider. Alright, and think about the toys as well. Most of the Kamen Rider belts that come out, they have their little extensions with them. They have their little accessories to go with the belts. And I do think that it would sell for people that are in their adolescent, teenager years, sometimes young adults, or even as kid ages, right? Now, I will say Kamen Rider is a little darker than Super Sentai. I mean, there have been cases where Kamen Riders or Kamen Rider villains have literally died. So I think it's a little dark in that sense. But I think other than that, I mean, they swear here and there, but Marvel movies sometimes do that. So think of it like Power Rangers, but if it were more leaning towards PG-13, kind of going in, touching a little bit of R, but mostly PG-13. And you would think, well, it's just PG-13. Why wouldn't it succeed? And so the thing with Kamen Rider is, you would say, well, kids like anime, right? And that's the thing, is that Kamen Rider to me is one of those series where, again, as I keep pointing to, with Power Rangers, the fact that Power Rangers is still around, obviously, there is still interest from people wanting to look into Power Rangers, right? Same thing with Sentai. Some people are still looking into Super Sentai and they're saying, well, they should keep it going. Same thing with Kamen Rider. It's still going, right? Now, another thing Hasbro could do if they were to adapt it is bring it over to a streaming service. Now, I do think that if anyone were to adapt Kamen Rider, they have to put it on a streaming service, kind of like Hasbro is starting to do with Power Rangers, since they put episodes 1 through 11 on Netflix. I would say that if Kamen Rider goes to a streaming service, just like how they would probably do if they did Ultraman, I think you would be reaching a huge audience. Now, granted, I did look this up before I went live today. I did look this up. Nielsen.com, one of the oldest yet more efficient TV rating systems, has said that even though Netflix and YouTube are gaining up, TV is still dominant in households in America. So you would think, well, where would Kamen Rider fit? That's the tricky part, because, you have FX, you have TNT, you have TBS, and so that's the tricky thing, is if they were to adapt it to a television station, I'm not exactly sure where it could fit. Because, again, a lot of kids these days are watching YouTube. They're watching stuff like Sentai, but not on television. They're watching it online. And I think with the resurgence of Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, YouTube Premium, I think now more than ever there is a demand for content. And if you were to give them Kamen Rider in a season, I think people would like it, because it's different than what you'd see with Power Rangers, It's not like your ordinary team of 5 or 6 Rangers, teenagers with attitudes and colored spandex. It's maybe 1 or 2 heroes with spandex, and then you got one evil Kamen Rider in most cases that has their evil version of henshinning. Then you have the allies that henshin a little bit, but most of it revolves around a main protagonist and a main antagonist. And most of the stories, if you keep up with it, it kind of makes sense. And that's the thing with 01 as well, is that when I started watching it, I felt like if I didn't keep up with an episode or 2, maybe I would get lost. But since I watched episode 1 and 2, I thought I was fine, because I was able to keep up with what was going on, because I understood the plot, right? That's kind of how I am with Power Rangers in 2023 as well, because it's like, in Power Rangers 2023, we really don't know what we're getting out of Hasbro. Kind of like what you might see from Kamen Rider. Now, obviously, if Hasbro were to cut ties with Toei and Tokusatsu, obviously Hasbro would not be able to adapt Kamen Rider, because if they did, I'm pretty sure that might result in a lawsuit basically saying, hey, you broke off the contract with us, you can't use our stuff. So that would make for a really sticky situation for Hasbro if they were to try and adapt Kamen Rider. And it's just like when I talked about Q Ranger last week. The fact that Hasbro is cutting ties off with Toei is interesting, because it does show that maybe Hasbro is trying to do something different with the franchise, and honestly, I'm all for that. And that's the thing with if they were to do a version of Kamen Rider, if Hasbro and Toei were not to split up, right? And you would think Hasbro would try to maybe do something with Kamen Rider, kind of like back in the day when they did Beetleborgs and VR Troopers. It's a weird thing with Transformers, right? Transformers, it's still around, and toys are still being sold by Hasbro. Now, granted, not all the toys that Hasbro makes are perfect, and I don't expect them to be. Same thing with Kamen Rider. I do think my only concern is that if Hasbro or whoever were to adapt Kamen Rider, I do feel like the toy quality might take a hit, because of the fact that normally Bandai Japan are really spot on with how the toys look in the show. But I mean, again, with it being Hasbro, The thing with Power Rangers Dino Fury is the toys have been decent from what I've been able to tell. Same thing with the Lightning Collection. Most of the figures have been really good, but they haven't been like solid S plus tier, god level toy design. Like, it doesn't need to be, right? It just needs to be pretty good. Same thing with the Kamen Rider stuff. The belts don't have to be, they don't have to be spectacular, but they need to be pretty cool. Hence why I like the 01 belt, because you had all the different little devices you could use with it, which was the appeal with Kamen Riders, that they had all these different little plugins and these different little toys that they sold, and sometimes when they did an anniversary season, they'd sell all of these toys to go with the Kamen Rider Henshin, and that is where, again, Hasbro might be interested, because as we know with Power Rangers, the number one thing that Hasbro is concerned with, and they should be, is the toys. Hasbro, at the end of the day, it's still a toy company that's trying to get media, right? So with that, I do think that Kamen Rider would be appealing to Hasbro. Now, granted, the downside with Kamen Rider is that there aren't a whole lot of mechas, right? Most of the time when you see a Kamen Rider fight, it's just the morphed up versions, or Henshin version, if you will, but there's no big monster fights, and so with that, you would be losing out on the big robots that you would see in Power Rangers or Super Sentai. And the same thing with Hasbro. Same thing why they keep up with Transformers, because Transformers are basically if you took out the Power Rangers in spandex and you just had the mechas. And you still see it today where people are still interested in robots. Same thing with kids, is that even in 2021, there are a decent amount of kids that are into robots. And I think the downside with Kamen Rider is that while you would have a good storyline, and while you would still have a good bit of merchandise with the belt, I think the lack of the robots being present, or the lack of mechas being present in Kamen Rider, would hinder it a little bit. And it would hinder it in the toy sales. But again, that shouldn't be a problem, because the belts, rightfully so, they cost a pretty penny sometimes. Sometimes they cost $40, $50, and some of the devices are $10, $12 depending on what the belt is, but rightfully so, because again, they take a lot of quality to be made. And so with that, I think overall, Kamen Rider should be adapted again, and it would be fun if we had something like a Kamen Rider Saber spinoff, or we saw a Kamen Rider 01 spinoff, or if we saw a Kamen Rider Gaim spinoff. All of these seasons have a different charm to them. Like, they all have a different, theme to them. Kind of like how Power Rangers and Super Sentai is like. And with that, it would keep Kamen Rider from being stale. And it's the same thing with, in terms of ratings, in terms of fans, do I think that Kamen Rider would be appealing sometime in the future? And I think maybe. But again, the thing is, Kamen Rider is more, if you're into Super Sentai, you probably will be into Kamen Rider. But if you haven't watched Super Sentai, but you're into Power Rangers, you might like Kamen Rider. But again, if you're not following Power Rangers, there's maybe not a chance you watch Kamen Rider. But again, everyone has their own taste, right? Some people like sports, some people like Marvel, some people like DC, right? Think about it, if you were to have a Batman television show, but again, you have the human form of Batman, and you have the Henshin version of Batman taking on the monster of the week. That's kind of like how Kamen Rider would be, It's almost like that, where it's like, you have your hero you focus on, you have the Henshin and all that. And because of that, I think because Marvel and DC still are really popular still, I think there is a chance that Kamen Rider can be adapted. But again, it really comes up to, what does Hasbro see in Kamen Rider? Or what would they see in Kamen Rider, right? And again, I do think it is kind of early to be that ambitious, because again, we don't necessarily know if Power Rangers with Hasbro is going to stick around for a long time, right? Because they're only like, a year and a half into doing Power Rangers now? Wait, that's not right. 2019. So they're pretty much 2 years into doing, the whole Power Rangers thing, right? This is just the first season of Dino Fury. And I do think, from what I saw on Twitter, and I looked at this for like a couple seconds for reference, there is a lot of fan hype with Dino Fury. And again, if kids are into Dino Fury, there might be a chance they might be into Kamen Rider. But again, I think with it being PG-13 oriented Kamen Rider I think maybe they would be taking a risk. But I think nonetheless, it should be subbed or dubbed in any way. But again, I think as someone who watches Power Rangers, in my opinion, is kind of biased, I do think there is a chance that we might see Kamen Rider be adapted, but it really comes down to who is willing to take a shot at, subbing or dubbing Kamen Rider. Will it be Shout Factory? Will we see, Shout Factory come back and do more Kamen Rider stuff? Will we see subs come to DVD or to Blu-ray? Will we see Hasbro take a shot with Netflix, or will someone put it on a streaming service? Who knows? What do you guys think about Kamen Rider potentially coming to the United States? Let me know down in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, I'm AndrewMycol, and I will see you in the next one. Go, Kamen Rider.